In October 1944, Japanese Escort Doctrine in the Philippine Sea classified USS Tang as operationally excessive rather than strategically decisive, because her patrol reports showed repeated surface engagements at ranges below 3,000 yards, sustained attack cycles exceeding standard submarine doctrine, and a willingness to remain inside convoy envelopes longer than escort reaction models assumed survivable. That classification rested on a concrete constraint. Escort commanders calculated that destroyer visual acquisition time at night, combined with Type 93 lookouts and manual plotting, would always exceed the exposure window of a submarine forced to surface to reload torpedo tubes. The doctrine assumed that aggression would inevitably self-limit through detection. USS Tang, Balao-class submarine SS-306, operating under Commander Richard O'Kane, entered this system on her fifth war patrol with 6 bow and 4 stern 21-inch torpedo tubes, a full load of Mark 18 electric torpedoes, and batteries rated for approximately 48 hours at patrol speed before voltage degradation imposed maneuver limits. The physical anchor governing her actions from the outset was reload time. Each internal reload cycle required approximately 10 minutes per tube under optimal conditions, longer if the boat maneuvered or if crew fatigue accumulated. This imposed a fixed tempo that could not be accelerated by intent. Japanese Convoy Escort Doctrine in late 1944 was built around perimeter integrity rather than interception. Escorts were assigned to maintain spacing of roughly 1,500 to 2,000 meters, creating overlapping visual and sonar coverage designed to deter submerged approach. However, the doctrine treated surface submarines as transient threats, assuming they would disengage immediately after firing to avoid counterattack. Tang violated this assumption systematically. After her first firing sequence, she remained within visual range, using darkness, low silhouette, and relative speed to reposition laterally rather than withdraw. The critical limitation on the escort side was command latency. Detection did not translate instantly into coordinated action. Visual reports had to be verified, relayed, and acted upon, a process that consumed minutes even under alert conditions. Tang exploited this delay repeatedly. Each time she surfaced, fired, and altered course before the escort network could reorient. She reset the engagement geometry. The escorts responded to the last known position, while Tang had already shifted several hundred yards, enough to break prediction models based on straight-line withdrawal. Inside Tang, the pressure accumulated differently. Battery draw increased with repeated high-speed surface maneuvers, forcing careful power management to preserve submerged endurance. Crew fatigue became a measurable factor after successive reloads, reducing handling speed and increasing error risk. Periscope exposure was minimized to intervals measured in seconds, forcing reliance on dead reckoning and visual estimation. These constraints narrowed the margin for correction with each engagement cycle. As the convoy defense began to fragment, Japanese escorts attempted to compensate by tightening formations, reducing spacing to improve mutual support. This adaptation introduced a new vulnerability. Reduced spacing limited maneuver freedom and increased the probability that one escort's turn would mask another's line of sight. Tang's surface attacks exploited this compression. By firing from positions that forced escorts to choose between pursuit and formation integrity, she induced hesitation. That hesitation translated directly into time, and time was the currency Tang required to reload and fire again. By the final phase of the engagement, the convoy's defensive system had entered saturation. Escorts were reacting faster, but not coherently. Orders overlapped. Search patterns conflicted. The system no longer behaved as designed. Tang's aggression did not overcome the escort's strength. It overwhelmed their coordination capacity. Each additional attack reduced the defender's ability to restore the original geometry. The decisive technical boundary was reached when cumulative stress altered the acoustic and visual environment beyond predictability. Machinery noise increased. Water disturbance from sinking ships interfered with detection. Tang's own signature grew as speed and maneuver demands intensified. The platform remained functional, but the system-level balance shifted. Risk no longer scaled linearly with reward. When the patrol ended, Japanese assessments were forced to revise their initial classification. The convoy was lost not because Tang ignored doctrine, but because doctrine underestimated how long a submarine could remain inside an engagement envelope before system collapse occurred. The assumption that aggression would self-terminate proved false under sustained pressure. At the operational level, the encounter demonstrated that Escort Doctrine based on deterrence rather than interception was vulnerable to tempo exploitation. At the strategic level, it reinforced the emerging reality of late 1944. Undersea warfare was no longer governed solely by detection and protection, but by the interaction of human decision cycles, mechanical limits, and time compression. USS Tang did not invalidate Japanese Escort Doctrine by accident. She exposed its boundary conditions by operating precisely at their edge. That exposure forced a reassessment not only on the Japanese side, but within U.S. submarine command as well. Tang's patrol provided a rare, data-dense case in which the limits of aggressive doctrine could be observed in real time rather than inferred post-war. The key variable was no longer detection probability alone, but engagement persistence. Tang demonstrated that once a submarine remained inside a convoy's defensive envelope beyond a certain duration, the escort system transitioned from deterrence to degradation. That transition point was measurable, not theoretical. Japanese Escort Doctrine assumed that surface contact with a submarine would immediately trigger withdrawal due to overwhelming counterfire risk. This assumption was rooted in earlier engagements where submarines lacked sufficient speed, night optics, or electric torpedoes to sustain surface operations. By late 1944, those assumptions were obsolete. Tang's surface speed exceeded 20 knots. Mark 18 torpedoes eliminated the telltale wake that previously exposed firing positions. Night conditions reduced visual acquisition to ranges where identification lagged behind maneuver. These factors combined to extend the viable surface engagement window far beyond doctrinal expectations. The controlling technical anchor during this phase was decision cycle compression. Escorts could detect Tang, but detection alone was insufficient. Identification, classification, and coordinated response required sequential human actions. Each action introduced delay. Tang's repeated re-entries into the convoy exploited this gap. The submarine did not need to outrun the escorts. She needed only to remain unpredictable long enough that each response addressed a position she no longer occupied. Inside the submarine, the cost of this approach accumulated steadily. Reload times lengthened as crew fatigue increased. Minor errors in handling required correction, consuming additional seconds. Battery reserves declined, constraining submerged options if forced to dive under pursuit. The margin for disengagement narrowed with every successful attack. Tang's operational posture became increasingly binary. Continue pressing the advantage or withdraw with incomplete exploitation. Japanese escorts attempted to adapt by increasing aggression. Searchlights were employed. Gunfire was directed at suspected silhouettes. Maneuver speeds increased. These actions raised the intensity of the engagement but did not restore coherence. In fact, they accelerated system saturation. Increased speed degraded sonar effectiveness. Searchlights narrowed visual focus, reducing peripheral awareness. Gunfire revealed escort positions more clearly than Tang's own profile. Each countermeasure addressed a perceived threat while introducing secondary vulnerabilities. At this stage, the engagement ceased to resemble conventional convoy defense and began to function as a time-limited contest of endurance. Tang's success depended on how long she could sustain pressure before cumulative constraints forced withdrawal. The escort's success depended on whether they could re-establish formation integrity before their own coordination degraded completely. Neither side possessed full control. The outcome hinged on which system reached its failure threshold first. The convoy's collapse occurred not at the moment of first contact, but after repeated cycles of incomplete response. Each ship lost reduced the escort's ability to protect the remainder. Each maneuver disrupted spacing further. Each minute spent reacting shortened the window for recovery. Tang's aggression accelerated this feedback loop. What began as a series of tactical engagements became a systemic failure. From a doctrinal perspective, the episode highlighted a mismatch between assumptions and reality. Escort Doctrine treated submarine aggression as self-limiting due to exposure risk. Tang showed that, under certain conditions, aggression could be self-reinforcing until external limits intervened. Those limits were not imposed by the enemy's strength, but by the submarine's own finite resources. The patrol, therefore, occupies a critical position in the late-war evolution of undersea combat. It demonstrated that submarines could dominate convoy engagements not by remaining unseen, but by manipulating time, attention, and decision cycles. It also demonstrated that such dominance could not be sustained indefinitely. The same tempo that dismantled the convoy also eroded Tang's safety margin. As reports from the patrol were analyzed, emphasis shifted subtly within U.S. command. Aggressive surface tactics were validated, but with an emerging awareness of saturation effects. The lesson was not to avoid risk, but to recognize when risk ceased to produce proportional returns. Tang's patrol provided empirical evidence of where that inflection point lay. The encounter off Formosa thus stands as a case study in how modern naval warfare transitioned from static doctrine to dynamic systems thinking. Victory was no longer determined solely by who possessed superior weapons or numbers, but by who understood the interaction of constraints more precisely, and who could operate closest to those constraints without crossing them. That understanding marked a broader transition in how submarine warfare was conceptualized by the end of 1944. Earlier doctrine treated submarines as platforms that either remained hidden or disengaged upon exposure. Tang's patrol demonstrated a third operational state, sustained contact without concealment, where survivability depended not on invisibility, but on tempo control and adversary disorientation. This state was unstable by definition. It could generate decisive results quickly, but it could not be maintained indefinitely. The technical anchor governing this final phase was resource convergence. Fuel consumption, battery depletion, torpedo inventory, crew endurance, and acoustic signature all moved toward critical thresholds simultaneously. None of these limits alone dictated withdrawal. Together, they formed a narrowing corridor in which any additional engagement increased the probability of irreversible failure. Tang's continued operations compressed that corridor minute by minute. Japanese escort forces, despite mounting losses, began to recover partial coherence as the engagement dragged on. Patterns reformed. Gunfire coordination improved. Search sectors stabilized. This recovery did not restore full defensive capability, but it reduced the randomness Tang had relied upon. The environment became more predictable, and predictability favored the defenders. Tang's advantage had been rooted in forcing escorts to react faster than they could organize. As reaction became more structured, that advantage diminished. Within the submarine, command decisions were increasingly constrained by physics rather than intent. Remaining torpedoes dictated target selection. Battery state limited submerged escape options. Damage was absent, but vulnerability increased as exposure accumulated. At this point, success could no longer be measured purely in ships sunk. It had to be weighed against the probability of survival. That probability was declining. What makes the episode analytically valuable is that it exposes a non-intuitive relationship between aggression and safety. Tang's most dangerous moments did not occur during initial contact, when escort forces were intact. They occurred later, when the convoy was already collapsing. As the external threat weakened, internal limits became dominant. The system turned inward. Risk shifted from enemy action to self-induced saturation. Post-war assessments often framed Tang's patrol as exceptional due to Commander O'Kane's skill and decisiveness. While leadership mattered, the more durable lesson lay elsewhere. The patrol showed that even optimal decision-making cannot override converging constraints indefinitely. Skill can extend margins. It cannot eliminate them. Tang's actions maximized the utility of those margins, but in doing so, consumed them. At a strategic level, this realization influenced how late-war submarine successes were interpreted. High kill counts were no longer seen solely as indicators of tactical brilliance. They were also markers of proximity to failure thresholds. Commanders were encouraged to recognize when additional success no longer justified escalating exposure. This did not lead to caution, but to selectivity. The Formosa engagement thus reframed the concept of aggression itself. Aggression was not an absolute quality, but a variable tied to system capacity. When capacity was high, aggression yielded disproportionate gains. When capacity eroded, the same behavior produced exponential risk. Tang's patrol captured that transition with rare clarity. In the broader context of the Pacific Campaign, this episode underscored how the balance of power had shifted. By late 1944, U.S. submarines possessed sufficient technical and operational superiority to dismantle convoy systems rapidly. The limiting factor was no longer enemy capability, but the sustainability of offensive tempo. That insight would carry forward into post-war submarine doctrine, shaping how undersea forces approached risk in an era of increasing speed and complexity. Tang's patrol did not merely destroy a convoy. It delineated the boundary between effective dominance and systemic overload. Understanding that boundary became one of the most valuable outcomes of the engagement, informing not just submarine warfare, but the emerging logic of modern, system-driven conflict. The patrol of USS Tang in the Philippine Sea in October 1944 belongs to a moment when naval warfare crossed a structural threshold. By that stage of the Pacific Campaign, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain was how force would be applied when technical superiority no longer needed caution to survive. Tang's engagement with Japanese convoy defenses revealed that the decisive variable had shifted away from concealment and firepower toward the management of interacting limits. Historically, this episode sits alongside other late-war engagements in which doctrine lagged behind capability. Escort systems were designed for an earlier phase of the conflict, when submarines were slower, more fragile, and dependent on stealth. Tang operated under different conditions: higher surface speed, electric torpedoes with reduced signature, improved night fighting capability, and crews hardened by years of combat. These changes did not simply improve effectiveness. They altered the shape of risk itself. Exposure became tolerable. Persistence became possible. The defensive assumptions that once governed convoy protection no longer held. At a broader level, Tang's patrol illustrates how modern warfare evolves when systems interact faster than doctrine can adapt. Japanese Escort Doctrine did not fail because it was poorly conceived. It failed because it was optimized for a threat profile that no longer existed. Tang exposed that mismatch by operating continuously at the boundary where detection, reaction time, and coordination intersected. The result was not a sudden breakthrough, but a progressive collapse driven by cumulative delay and fragmentation. For the U.S. Navy, the significance of this patrol lay in what it clarified rather than what it destroyed. It demonstrated that submarines could impose decisive effects through tempo alone, but also that tempo had a measurable cost. The same mechanisms that allowed Tang to dominate the engagement, sustained surface operations, compressed decision cycles, and relentless pressure, also eroded her safety margin. The patrol mapped the outer edge of what aggressive submarine doctrine could achieve before internal limits became dominant. In historical perspective, Tang's experience foreshadowed a central problem of post-war military systems. As platforms grew faster and more capable, failure increasingly resulted not from enemy strength, but from saturation, misalignment, and cumulative stress. Success and catastrophe moved closer together in time and space. Margins shrank. Decisions mattered not because they were bold, but because they were made under conditions where alternatives had already disappeared. The convoy off Formosa was lost within hours. The doctrinal implications unfolded over years. Tang's patrol stands as a precise case study of how superiority, once achieved, demands a new form of discipline. Not restraint born of weakness, but restraint informed by an understanding of system limits. In that sense, the patrol marks a transition point. It shows how late-war undersea combat ceased to be a contest of concealment and became a test of how long complex systems could be driven at maximum load before they failed. That is the enduring historical scale of the episode. USS Tang did not simply challenge Japanese escort doctrine. She demonstrated how modern warfare punishes any system that assumes aggression will resolve itself automatically. When systems are pushed beyond their design envelope, outcomes are no longer governed by intention or doctrine, but by the hard convergence of time, capacity, and irreversible constraint.